Welcome back to Gale Force Wins Season 5.
Well, I'm Allan Dale from Gale Force Wins, and I got to tell you, it's a great pleasure to be here in beautiful Toronto, Ontario. You know, a lot of people come and go in your lives, and you make great connections. And there's one thing about when you serve in the Navy, you can be away from a friend for a very long time, and then you come back together, and within a few minutes, you're right back to where you left off. And that's where this conversation has taken us now. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Jason Donville on to the Gale Force Wins program. So Jason, why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and take us right back to the very beginning.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Western Canada, primarily Saskatchewan and Alberta. My parents, we moved a lot when I was a kid. I lived in a lot of places, went to a lot of schools when I was a kid. But probably, spent the formative years of my life in Calgary. And then when I turned 18, like yourself, decided I wanted to do something adventuresome with my life, and went down to the recruiting office, and lo and behold, I got in.
Okay.
Yeah, so that sent me from Calgary to, first of all, Victoria, Royal Roads. So I did 2 years at Royal Roads Military College with my summers at sea, and then 2 years at RMC in Kingston, and then into the Navy, and that's when we met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jason, you say you grew up in Western Canada, moved around a lot. Talk to me about that experience, moving around a lot as a kid. What did that teach you, or what were the troubles and tribulations around that?
Yeah, so I don't know how personal you want people to get, right? But a lot of the stuff about my childhood, I've only started to kind of talk about recently, right? So I came from a family that had a lot of issues, right? With substance abuse. Both my parents were addicts, right? Okay. And I always hid that because I lived in this world where you're an officer and you're a professional, right? And for example, when I was in my second year at Royal Roads, my father overdosed. Okay. How many people are in the military college who go, hey, I was just talking with my mom, and guess what? My dad overdosed last night, right? That was the kind of life that I lived in. So if you ever, that J.D. Vance, the guy who's the vice president, if you ever read Hellbilly Elegy kind of stuff, he's got a similar background where he's got this completely messed up childhood, right? And then all of a sudden gets himself in the military, and that kind of helps him get straightened out. So when I was a kid, I went to, between kindergarten and grade 12, I went to 11 schools because we were continuously moving. That in itself is traumatic, right? Then the issues that my parents had just with dealing with life and that kind of stuff. So beyond this facade, because I was always a good student and a good athlete, but beyond this facade, there was this really difficult kind of childhood, right? And then you sort of get out into the military, and the military kind of had that kind of tough love. It kind of cleaned me up, and you just kind of built momentum. And as you put distance from that experience, you were able to build a kind of a good life. But yeah, I think some of my friends and family members who knew what the childhood was like, they kind of look back and go, wow, it's kind of surprised that you've done as well as you've done, given the shaky start, right? But it was definitely a shaky start, and it was something that, if you had asked me this question 20 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten this answer. Right. It's only in the last few years that I've been comfortable kind of talking about it.
Yeah, I certainly didn't know that, and we've known each other a long time. Yeah. And I didn't know that. So the military, would you call it a bit of an escape? Was that what it was?
Absolutely, it was a rescue because it wasn't just that adventure. I had to get away from home because I could not stay any longer, right? And in fact, once again, people don't know this because I've never told very few. I actually dropped out of high school. It was so bad, and I went and lived with another family, and then realized I couldn't get anywhere in life, and then went back and took night school and summer school, and was still able to graduate on time. I never mentioned that to the recruiters. I didn't want them to know, where they went, what the heck what's going on here? And and yet my grades were high enough to get into engineering, right? So I wasn't just an average student. I was a strong student. So I never lost that. I always had that strong mental faculty and that drive, and I was a good athlete. But yeah, when I look back at and it's funny because when I read J.D. Vance's book, and then I also read another book by Tara Westover, which is called Educated, and she has a similar childhood experience growing up in rural Idaho, and it was like, oh my God, these two books are like what I experienced, and yet in both cases they went on to have good careers and get a great education and stuff like that. So I wasn't alone in having this incredibly insane childhood and then still being able to make something of myself.
Athletics, you mentioned that a number of times. Talk to me about the importance of that.
Yeah, I was always a good athlete when I was a kid, and then, hockey and lacrosse and football were a lot more casual back in the 70s when I was growing up. So I played on a lot of good teams, but I was pretty good in lacrosse. And for those people who know, about my kids, my children are good lacrosse players as well. And so, yeah, I was on a team and ended up going to the Canada Summer Games. I was on Team Alberta and, played at the fairly high level all the way through. But sports was never as serious or as financially financially as difficult it is to play like AAA hockey now, kind of stuff. So you didn't have to come from a wealthy family to play on a good hockey or a lacrosse team. But yeah, the athletics was important, but lacrosse in particular was, for some reason, it was my sanctuary. It was this place where, but I also, it was part of it was my dad, who wasn't a lacrosse player, but for some reason he grew up in Mimico and he loved lacrosse. And it was like, there was this thinking of, if I became a great lacrosse player, my dad would love me.
Right, yeah.
Well, and one day I woke up and realized he's so self-absorbed, he's never going to even notice who I am. Yeah. But by that time, I'd already got the bug. I'd fallen in love with lacrosse. It had become my happy spot. And I was getting all this kind of positive reinforcement from my coaches and players that I wasn't getting, presumably in the home kind of stuff.
Right.
So lacrosse, for me, of all the sports that I play and that my family plays, it has kind of an elevated position, right? Because it was kind of it was one of those sanctuaries. And then once I went to the military college, just in the military, 7 or 8 years, because we had great leaders. There was always a few guys that weren't great, but you and I can you can talk about the 4 or 5 people that had the greatest influence in our life, and probably most of them come from the military, right? So, and I just got onto that thing, and then it just built. It just went from there. You just learn. This is what is right. This is what is wrong. This is what hard work is like. This is when you need to back off on something. You just learn great leadership techniques from the people that we were serving under.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, arriving at Royal Roads back in the day with that sort of background that you just described, talk to me about that experience, those first few weeks and months where you're thrust into a campus with a whole bunch of people coming from really diverse backgrounds, all coming together. What was that like for you?
So it was a rush on one level, because you're like, oh my God. But also for me, there was also a family dynamic right away, because you know how social the military is, right? You're part of a mess. You've got all these brothers, all that kind of stuff, right? So for me, that part was great, but yeah, it was challenging. Like, we were stressed out, right? We were working our can off. I can remember one of the things I remember for all 4 years of military college is being tired all the time. Right, and I went on to do an MBA, and I was not tired all the time. For the rest of my life, I was not tired. But for all 4 years of military, I was perpetually tired.
Yeah, and friends that you would have met there, still friends today?
Oh yeah,
some of them.
Yep.
Yeah, and the same sort of relationship like you and I have, where time will pass.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, you go certain times of your life when you're in university, you all go off into the world, and then around this age, you start to reconnect.
Yeah, and
I think there is a desire to want to complete the circle,
right?
To go back to the origins kind of stuff, and also to do some soul searching in life and say, what's the meaning of all this? And I don't look back and have a lot of regrets, to be honest. Like, a tough childhood, but boy, not from the time I was 18 onwards, not much to complain about, to be honest. Not many regrets, if any, I can think of.
Yeah. Now, you grew up Western Canada. Would not mean a lot of water in your life, certainly a lot of ocean. What was that experience like for you in the Navy when you would go in the summers and join a ship?
Well, let me tell you how I got into the Navy versus the Army or the Air Force. I was so desperate to get into the military college. I went into the recruiting office and said, "What do you have the greatest shortage of?" What? The guy said, "Mars, Marie, and Millie." Great, so put those as my 3 choices in order of what you're most desperate.
Is that right?
That's how I chose.
And that's how you found Mars. But tell me about what the going to sea experience was like. Do you remember the first time you went on board a ship? Talk to me about that.
Pardon me. Yeah, it was interesting enough, but you know what I really loved, and more on the East Coast and the West Coast, was that culture.
Right.
We were talking about Barrett's Privateers before we started recording, and going to the lower deck, and the traditions that were for people who grew up in Newfoundland or grew up in Nova Scotia or whatever. Those, the people who knew stories about the Blue Nose and stuff. I thought that was really, really cool. Yeah.
It is, and it is quite a culture, isn't it? Is that sort of pub culture and that camaraderie and just sort of that. It almost stems back to the history of the Navy, right?
Yeah, I think it's the Canadian Navy for sure. I know that there's people outside who think about the Royal Navy and all this British stuff. That was gone by the time we got in. I didn't feel like I was serving in the appendage of the Royal Navy at all. You know what the convoys did during World War II and the Flower class and all that kind of the corvettes and stuff like that. I couldn't name you what the British Navy did in World War I or II.
Right.
But I had a pretty good feel of what the Canadian Navy did and what our role was. And so this, we have all this stuff in the pages every day about colonialism and all that stuff. And it's just like, like I know there's a big discussion about the Heart of Oak, the song Heart of Oak, whether we're going to keep it or not. For me, I couldn't care less. I never loved that song in the first place.
Yeah, I get you.
Right? It just becomes something that the culture warriors can get to play around with in the in the Globe and Mail or the Star. But if they replace that song with something else, I don't really care.
Academics, you took to it in school. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, and I was a good student all the way through, both at an undergrad and at the MBA level. I've always been good with numbers, but I've also been a good writer. So going into finance, if you were numerate, and also you could write reports and stuff, you had a lot of options or whatever. So yeah, I've always enjoyed learning. I've always been a person who didn't do the minimum academically, that enjoyed getting my courses and my books and that kind of stuff. So, and I do look back on my life and go that education was the great liberator for me. Right. We live in a knowledge-based society, and I work in a knowledge-based industry, right? And so I just kind of followed my instincts, but when I look back, it's like, boy, I made some really good choices.
Yeah. Now, how long did you spend in the Navy, and what was that journey like after school for you?
So I was in for 8 years, so the 4 and 4 plan. So 4 years of military college, but summers at sea, and then 4 years in the Navy. But remember, if you'll recall, April 1989, you and I are at the Fleet School. We're on our submarine course, basic submariners course, and an announcement comes out. And that announcement is the nuclear submarines that you and I are training to become a part of has been canceled. And at the same time, the Berlin Wall's coming down. So I'm looking around and going, I think the next 10 years is going to be tough, that the Navy's likely to plateau or even contract. And I go, I think all the things that I want to do in life, the next decade are probably not going to happen in the Navy. So I start looking around at other options, and I end up deciding to go back to school and getting an MBA. And I don't think I made a mistake, because, the 90s were fairly active for the Army. A lot of stuff going on in Bosnia and stuff like that. But I don't look back at any of my buddies who stayed on and did a full career in the Navy. Like, I respect the fact that they served their country. But I mean, I spent the 90s in Southeast Asia. And it was a really, really interesting time to be in Southeast Asia. And I was doing all kinds of things with companies, and I was meeting politicians. I attended Lee Kuan Yew's last press conference because my brother was there as a journalist, and he said, there's extra seats, just tag in. So I'm literally sitting in this room with 40 journalists and Lee Kuan Yew in his last press conference. And I was in Hong Kong for for the end of the British rule and turn over to China and all that kind of stuff. And wow, Hong Kong was and Singapore and Jakarta were really dynamic places. So,
Jason, what gave you the vision? I mean, because we were together then.
Yeah.
You and I were together then when they made that. What gave you the vision to say, I need to look at something different? I mean, because I remember we were young, we were in the moment, sort of just getting through every day. But where did that vision come from?
Well, it's funny because somebody asked me that question kind of in a different way. But one of the things I realized is that some people, we were talking about the guys who stay in and became admirals, and the guys like myself who left. Some people do really well in structured environments, and some people do really well in unstructured environments. And I think the less structure, the more chaos there is, that's really good for me. I have a good ability to look through chaos. So, yeah, I think that was part of it. But I also, you got to look back, and some of it's serendipity, some of it's just luck.
Yeah.
You can't just say, oh my God, I was a genius. I made some really smart decisions in my 20s and 30s, and I look back and go, it was just instinct or gut check. I had no clue. But I also did some things that were relatively risky. Like, so when I finished with my MBA, I didn't have a job. I bought a one-way ticket to Singapore with $2,000 in my pocket, no job.
Right.
I didn't have enough money to buy the ticket back.
Yeah.
I just knew I was going to find a job.
Some of that happened.
But if my kids did that now, I go, that's crazy. Just to fly halfway around the world with no job and $2,000 in your pocket, and just assume you're going to be able to get a job. And I got one.
So, I mean, you described something there. I mean, being very comfortable with risk and chaos and all of that, and luck. And there's a little bit of luck in everything, right?
Yeah.
As you so rightly point out. So you leave the Navy, you head off to Southeast Asia. Talk to me about that whole journey for you over there.
Yeah, so I arrived there, and so once again, I was a good writer when I was young, and I did, most of the courses I took in military college were essays. And then I don't know if you recall, but when we were in the Navy, one of the admiral's speechwriters went on mat leave, and the admiral needed another speechwriter, and I was kind of between courses, so I got sent up to Navy headquarters, and I was a speechwriter for about 7 or 8 months, right? And then I went and did my MBA at Western, and that was an all case study, so all your exams were essays. So by the time I finished my MBA, I've been writing one form of writing for a long, long time. So when I was graduating from MBA, I said to myself, and I said to the people I was, kind of applying to, who in the corporate world needs writers, right? And it was investment banking and management consulting that needed writers, because both industries generated a lot of reports. So that's how I was pitching myself. And the first job I got, the guy hired me as an analyst, and he said, okay, so what industries do you know anything about, right? And I go, I've been on submarines and destroyers for the last 8 years, but I'm a good writer. And he goes, oh, actually, that's worked out well, because we have this massive shipbuilding and ship repair industry in Singapore that's public. You need people to write about it, and you'll be perfect, even though commercial shipping and the Navy had nothing. But none of the Singaporeans wanted to cover those industries. They found it unglamorous. All the Singaporean analysts wanted to do banking or tech, right?
Okay.
So I said, yeah, I'll do ship repair. And the thing was, as soon as you go in and talk to a CEO of a ship repair company or a shipping company, as soon as you establish your credibility as somebody who's gone to sea,
right,
you're there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so you had good success with that group?
Absolutely.
Is that right? So in Singapore for a while, and then where after Singapore?
Then Jakarta, which is the capital of Indonesia. And by flight, it's like an hour and a half away from Singapore. And then I became the head of the office in Singapore. And 30, right? And then back to Singapore to be the head of the region.
Wow. Jason, so you're in Singapore. That's a big stretch, right? Coming from, Western Canada, Saskatchewan, growing up as you do, to Singapore. Singapore, beautiful, beautiful place, and you're leading an organization. Talk to me about it. I mean, that's a huge change.
It's a huge change, but you know what? Once again, bringing it back to the Navy, right? Every place I go, I get put in charge within 6 months. And that's not stuff I learned in business school.
Right.
It's the stuff I learned as a junior officer. Because you know how you build up leadership, where you put a guy in charge of a task with a bit of resources, and he's got 3 guys to deal with. And then before you know it, he's got a task with 5 guys. You just learn how to project manage project after project. You were always organizing something, right? Whether you're the deck officer or whatever, you were just always managing projects. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in the business world, and you realize that's a skill set that's actually relatively rare. So everywhere I went, I became in charge. Now I think I was good at the analytical stuff as well, but it was definitely the project management skills that got me over and over again, put me in charge.
When did you come back from Singapore? Was there anything in between Singapore and coming back to Canada?
Yes, no, there wasn't anything in between. So I came back. My ex-wife didn't want to stay there forever.
Right.
And when my oldest son was ready to start grade 1, she said that's kind of the line in the sand. So we came back when he was starting grade 1, and briefly stopped in Calgary, but realized if I'm not an oil and gas guy, I really can't do finance in Calgary. I had to get to Toronto. So after 2 years, we came on here, and I've been here since 2002.
2002. Yeah. And so what did you get into as soon as you came to Toronto? Did you start your own thing?
So by the time I left Asia, I was the head of research for Southeast Asia. So I had this huge group of like 60 guys that I managed. So when I came back to Canada, I didn't really get any credit for that. So I went right back to being like a junior analyst, right? Started right at the bottom, but did quite well like coming out of the gates, in part because I had the background and the experience, but never got anything managerial. So I ended up working for Sprott, which became Cormark, just changed its name. I was there for about 5 years, and then I got to that point, late 30s or early 40s, when I just went, I don't think I want to work for anybody anymore. And I had some savings. I said, I'm going to start my own fund so I can manage my own money. And if anybody wants to give me money, then they'll charge them a management fee. So in 2007, I started Donville Canada Asset Management.
And that's how it works. So you start your own, you're kind of managing your own initially, and then people jump on board because they believe in your ability to predict.
Yeah, and my returns in the first 3 years were quite good, but there's a lot of people that were having kind of a wait and see. Okay, you've done well for 6 months, a year. And then all of a sudden, in the 4th year, whoosh, the floodgates opened, and a lot of money came in.
Is that right?
Yeah, so the business really started to really flourish in my 4th year.
And how big would the business be now?
Well, the business is kind of
not money-wise, but people-wise, and
no, it's not super. It's not super headcount intensive. So I mean, I'm involved with several other companies that I kind of don't own 100% of, but let's say I own 35 or 40%. So the businesses where I have a large personal ownership, the number of employees would be about 30. The hedge fund itself's not that labor intensive, though. You're managing assets, but it's pretty much a brain business as opposed to a managerial one. So that one doesn't require that much people management, to be honest.
Right.
That's a much more analytical analytical business and a lot less managerial. Whereas a research department, you have to make sure there's a flow of product coming out, right? With a hedge fund, you don't have to produce any product.
Right. So the hedge fund is trucking along. You're involved in a number of different businesses now.
Yep.
What else is consuming your energy at the moment?
Yeah. So there's a couple other things that I've been involved with. One that's more recent and one that's I still have an interest. So I got quite involved with lacrosse over the years. And when I came back to Canada in early 2002, I ended up meeting up with a guy who was involved with the Toronto Rock lacrosse team.
Yep.
And at that time, the team, when it had been set up, was they got like 30 guys to throw in a few bucks to start the team up, and those guys wanted to get out. So I was buying out guys like Ty Domi or Don Cherry, who had a 4% stake. I was just buying their 4. So eventually I owned, 16 or 18% of the Toronto Rock at one point in time. Then we sold that. Then I got involved with another professional lacrosse team, and then just got wasn't owning professional lacrosse teams, but was getting kind of involved with Team Canada lacrosse, just kind of helping them out, because it was Team Canada, like a lot of national teams, are run on fumes. There's no budget there. And then years later, there was a labor dispute between the players and the management of the Canadian Lacrosse Association, and the players were prepared to not go to the World Championships in 2018 to make their point on things like insurance and costs and that kind of stuff. So they finally, at the 11th hour, said, okay, we're going to try to make this work, but they had to pick somebody that both sides either trusted or I put hated equally or whatever. So they asked me. Okay. Both sides asked me to come in, and what I did then for the next 5 or 6 years is every time the dispute would come up, as I would just drive it back to the contract. I'd learned that from labor law. It's just like they can say, both sides can say whatever they want, but what did you agree to? Right. Just keep driving them back to the contract. So I did that for a while, and I just stepped down from that about a year ago. At the same time, both of my boys have been elite lacrosse players, and so I have the youngest son. The oldest son's not active anymore, but the youngest son is playing professional lacrosse. So every weekend I will either be watching it here on my laptop, depending where he's playing, or this past Saturday I drove down to Rochester to see my son play. So so there's the lacrosse part of my life that now I'm pretty much just a dad who's a fan. Right. Then the last couple of years I started getting involved with the arts. And I got involved with the arts on a whole bunch of so filmmaking is one area I got involved with. Wrote a novel, which I'm trying to get published right now, and getting involved in kind of making coffee table books, art books or whatever. So my first coffee table book will come out in February. So that artsy side, these are just passion projects on the side. So I've got a lot of artistic stuff happening on the side. Where did that artistic stuff come from? I always knew you to be sort of artsy fartsy. No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. But I always knew you to be sort of a creative guy, kind of fun guy, enjoyed music, enjoyed the whole culture, but I never knew there was an art side to you like that. Yeah, so it was always there, and we can't do it in the context of the podcast, but I still have my sketchbooks from when I was a kid, and when you walk around, we're doing this interview in my condo, some of the paintings on the walls are my paintings. Wow. I painted them myself, right? So I've always been a painter, drawer, sketcher. There's a guitar there. I play the guitar, that kind of stuff. So the artistic side, but you know how I was saying with my childhood where I didn't tell anybody about that. Right. And it's only in the last few years I've been comfortable kind of letting that come out, and also reconnecting with my artistic self, right? Wow. And as a child, even though I had this crazy childhood, my parents didn't invalidate my artistic self. Right. But I was conscious, coming out of high school, that I was going to have a job that gave me financial security. That was really important. And so I chose that financial security over anything that I was going to do on the artistic side. No regrets. Right. There's a ton of people who would sit here and go, that I made a big mistake, whatever. I didn't. Right. I didn't. You have to know what it's like to be dirt poor. Right. You have to know what it's like to live in a neighborhood where you come home from school and you're in one of those neighborhoods where the neighbor's furniture is on the front lawn and it's raining. Right. That you see that once or twice in your childhood, and it shatters you. It gets me emotional just thinking about it. Even though it's not your house, it'll happen to us next week. Yeah. Are you telling your parents, tell me that's not going to happen to us next week, right? So I had to have something where I had to have that financial security, right? So, so no regrets. Yeah. So you settled the financial side. Now you're able to sort of unleash the other part of you. Yeah. And so a lot of stuff that I'm doing, like like there's no profit. Like I'm doing a book on figurative painting right now that will, and the AGO is helping out. It's going to be a wonderful book that celebrates Canadian figurative painting, right? There's no profit in it. There's I'll eat the cost of it. So it's a form of philanthropy, but it's not the same as writing a check for $100,000 to the Canadian Cancer Society. It's a little bit more selfish in the sense that I get to participate. I get to meet the artists and all that kind of stuff. So it's a form of philanthropy that I wouldn't put it on the same plateau as somebody who gives $100,000 to a charity for Alzheimer's or something. But I am giving back to the arts community into a lot of projects that help an emerging filmmaker make a film where he's got zero chance of making it. Right? I talked to you earlier today about someday I'd like to do an homage to St. John's, Newfoundland.
Talk to me about that.
Well,
what's that look like to you?
So just as a little background, between high school and university, I went on this youth exchange called Canada World Youth.
Okay.
Right? And when I got picked to go on Canada World Youth, the way it worked back then, it was kind of like Katima Vic, right? Where they would send you to a part of Canada for 4 months and then to a developing country for four months. So they sent me to St. John's. And so when you go to St. John's, you go there with like 21 other Canadians and you get billeted with families. And then they quickly assign you to some kind of volunteer work on the first day. And I was an artist. So they said, we're going to assign you to the Royal Newfoundland Museum, which was at the corner of Duckworth and Cathedral Street. And I worked as an illustrator. And after this podcast is over, I'll show you some of the posters I did when I was working on Duckworth Street. Because I still have them. I had to show them to my friend Christina because she thought I was pulling her leg, right? So I was an artist. And this is back and before the computer. So you're literally doing pen and ink stuff or whatever. Then you're mimeographing them or whatever to make the posters that you hang up to say that we're having some mummers event, right? Or there's going to be some kind of an event happening at the Royal Newfoundland Museum in October, and I was making the posters and all that kind of stuff, right? So I had that 4 months there where, you and I would have talked about this when we were in the Navy, where like, I've been to the ship inn, and I know the name keeps changing because it was called the ship inn, and now it's called the ship's inn, or whatever. For legal reasons, as it changes over, they have to keep tweaking the name slightly. It's where it's between Water and Duckworth kind of stuff, where you go up those steps. And I had a feel for that culture. Now, when I was there, I didn't have a lot of money, but I had a lot of time on my hands when I was there. So I spent a lot of time just on my own, walking the streets all around the inner harbor, and then up to Signal Hill and all that kind of stuff. So I really got a feel for St. John. So then all of a sudden, I went back with this friend of mine. Her name's Christina, and she's a lawyer from St. John's. And we went back to Newfoundland, and that's when it really hit me. I want to do some kind of a story that's based in St. John's.
It had that much impact on you?
Yeah. Because I think there is. Remember, we talked to this. I don't know if we talked to this before we started on the podcast, but there's a circle thing where there's a certain thing in life where we want to circle back and we want to go back and we want to understand stuff, but we also want to say thank you to stuff, right? And I had this really wonderful experience because this was my first 4 months getting out of that hellhole where I was living, right? And so there's this feeling about this was really like the first day of the rest of my life started in St. John's kind of stuff, right? And then I went off after those 4 months, went to Indonesia. So guess what? Southeast Asia is already planted, and hence why I went back there a number of years later. And then I come back from Indonesia. It's like April. And because it was sponsored by the government of Canada, I had to go down to the government office in downtown Calgary, and the recruiting office is right there.
Right.
And I'm going, I didn't have the confidence to apply for military college until I'd gone off for this 8 months. It had filled me with that much. I went and said to the guy, I said, what about, like, I'm thinking about military college, because it's April, it's too late to apply for this year. But the following year, he goes, the deadline was actually in January, but the board doesn't actually sit to review the files for 4 more days. How fast can you move to get your paperwork? I will squeeze you in.
Right.
And he explained to me that all the recruiting offices were like competing against each other. Like he was incentivized to get me in.
Yeah.
So this was like a Tuesday. I got all my medicals and all that stuff done by the Friday. It was all slapped in. And then a month and a half later, I get the phone call saying, guess what? You're going to Royal Roads.
I love that story about how Newfoundland impacted you so meaningfully, so early on, that it makes you want to go back and contribute and give something back to that community. What is your vision for that film, that story that you have in your mind?
I mean, I think it's got to be, if we want to get into the nuances of filmmaking, we talked about some of the stuff before that, right? I mean, I don't want to say I'm an authority on Newfoundland film, but I saw The Rowdy Man when I was a kid, so that certainly had certain impact on me. having experienced now 6 or 7 films in my early stage of filmmaking across a lot of genres, I know I want to do feel good. I don't want to do horror. Horror is really popular right now because it's easy to be. It's easy to get financial success with horror because it translates across all boards. But I want to do feel good. I want to do something like the Full Monty type thing, right? Or that movie. I don't know if it's a movie and a play called Once. It takes place in a pub in Dublin, kind of stuff. And I wanted to tie into the richness of St. John's, which is the music, the geography, the storytelling, the laughter, that kind of stuff, and that shows St. John's not just in a kitschy kind of way, but shows the sort of the depth and why most people, hopefully you'll find this flag. Most people, the rest of Canada, when the Newfoundlander walks in the room, they're always friendly because everybody loves the Newfoundlander because they're warm people, they're friendly, they're great storytellers, that kind of stuff. So make a movie about that, right? And so I have a strong feeling about that, and I think something will happen there.
I mean, you're warm and you're friendly and you're a good storyteller as well.
Well, 4 months in St. John's will do to anybody, right?
So the goal is to create that and sort of as a gift to St. John's and unleash your creative
but a gift to itself as well, because as I said to you before, I'm not looking to bring a bunch of cameramen or sound guys from elsewhere. There's enough talent in St. John's and I know, we got boots on the ground. We might want to bring in one star from somewhere else just to make it interesting, particularly to give it reach beyond, beyond Canada kind of stuff. And we've talked about that. But you know who I have in mind for my my star, and he's got a wonderful voice. It's got to have a movie about St. John's that doesn't have music in it is not a movie about St. John's. It's got to have music in it because all cultures are rooted in storytelling. Newfoundlanders are phenomenal storytellers. But so much of it's in the songs, right? So yeah.
I mean, this is a very exciting thing to be involved in for you right now in your life. Is there other things on the horizon right now that you're really excited about?
Well, we were talking once again off camera about I'm 61, and my generation. If you're from a storytelling point of view, we're entering what people often say it's the third act, right? The first act is from time you're born until you're 30. The second act is 30 to 60, and the third act is 60 and beyond. And I saw an interview recently with David Suzuki, and I have mixed feelings about David Suzuki, trust me, right? But he does say some pretty intelligent things, and he sort of said, when you get to this age, we're elders now. It's not as much about doing as it is about giving back, but also if you've had certain life experiences, to provide guidance and leadership and support, but not a 70-hour week, right? And I think for me, one of the things that I've had, I don't know where this comes from, but maybe the military explains a lot of this, is I know how to get shit done. And the thing about working with creative types is that's what I bring into it. You say, oh my God, you're doing this great book, or you're doing this movie, that's really cool. What was your actual contribution? I go, I put some money in. But the other thing is, I'm good at the project management. I'm good at keeping the project focused so we actually get a completed movie, book, whatever at the end of the day. And I think a lot of times the creatives that I work with, they go, you're great because you don't push the creatives around, you don't rob their creative, but you're really good at keeping us on point. We could just dither all day long if you aren't keeping us to deadlines and that kind of stuff. So I think I can play that kind of role. And even with the film in Newfoundland, I have no interest in going behind the camera. I have no interest in a whole bunch of the things, but I'm really interested in getting something done. So we took a stab at writing the great Newfoundland movie kind of thing.
Are your boys creative?
Well, my oldest son is a pediatric ICU doctor. I don't know. There's probably some creative stuff.
Got to be creative stuff.
There's got to be something there. My daughter, it works in the business world in the UK, and I know she's involved with the theater world. So yeah, she's got a creative side there, and she was a very good figure skater. The synchronized figure skating, where you skate with like a group of 12 or whatever, right? Which I think takes on a certain creativity. And then my youngest son, he's a professional lacrosse player by day, but he's a journalist on the side. So he was writing all the time. So yeah, I would say each of my kids have a creative side.
What do the kids think of you tapping into your creative side right now?
Oh, well, you have kids, so there's a certain stage in your life where they just kind of go, oh God, Dad, right? And then other times, you know, then over time they look back and go, oh, it was actually kind of interesting or whatever, right? So, so I think it's kind of got a duality to it. I mean, kids keep you grounded. They allow you not to take yourself too serious, and I think that's really healthy. Yeah. But yeah, I have a really good relationship with my kids. I actually have a good relationship with my ex-wife. She's a wonderful person, and we still co-parent. Right. You know, so you know we're not together anymore. But if ever any of our kids have an issue, I tell my kids, you know, like, you know, if you have an issue, call me. But unless you tell me otherwise, as soon as we finish talking, I'm calling Mom. Yeah. Right. And I said, and that's a good thing, right? And they've never told me not to call Mom. So because their mother and I have very different strengths, but between the two of us, we cover a lot of ground kind of stuff, right? Yeah. So I think my kids, my kids know when to, you know, take the, you know, say, Dad, ease back here a little bit, or Dad, that's a little bit ridiculous, or whatever, right? So I think that's fine. But I think 15-year-olds get far more embarrassed than 30-year-olds do, right? They, by the time you get to a certain point, you go, okay, that's just Dad, and I don't have to own it. If Dad decides to say something silly, they don't have to own it, kind of stuff, right?
Jason, you've always been a pretty grounded guy, right? I mean, you've always been pretty level. In everything that you just described to me now, you're a pretty level guy, right? You know, even raising the parent your kids with an ex-wife, everything is really grounded and level. And where does that, like, how do you get like that? How do you keep things so calm? It's a tumultuous world, man. Like, there's a lot of crap going on, and you're in a world where money is moving fast. But you seem to be a very grounded and easygoing guy. How do you manage that?
I don't know. If that's a compliment, so thank you very much for the compliment. Then I don't know if I have to. I don't know if I want to think about that too much, other than just to try to, like, you know, do the right thing every day, right? But I sometimes, you know, when we have a bit of a shtick or something like that, where I'll start saying, like, hey, I'm the most modest guy I know. I'm also the hardest working guy. Like, it's kind of a joke. Right. I think that those compliments shouldn't be coming from me, right? I think I should just try to do the right thing, or whatever. And as far as grounding or stuff like that, I don't know where that comes from. But here's what I would say, just as a moral person, right? I'm a better person today than I was, even like in my first 10 years leaving home. I'm not trying to be hard on my childhood or whatever, but I have been positively influenced by some really, really good people in my life, and I could name names of guys in the Navy, you know, and when you may not even have the same conclusions on these guys, but they were really good leaders to me. Kevin Greenwood was a great positive influence on my life, and not everybody may say that, although I think more people would than not. But he was a great influence on my life. You know, Walter Natinchuk, who became the Chief of Defense Staff, was a very positive influence in my life. You know, I can name others kind of stuff, right? There were some great guys in Subron, right? And there was also some complete nut bars, but I remember the great guys way more than I remember the nut bars, right? So that 8 years in the military, it set me up really, really well with terms of role models and good leaders, and when to kick somebody in the butt and when to give them a hug. Right? There was just guys who they just had a good feel for how to lead people, right? And I think I'm a better person now because I actually paid attention to what the good ones did, and you know what they were passing on. And I'm not a perfect guy by any means, right? But the good things that I do, I give a lot of credit to those leaders. And I had some pretty good leaders in Asia as well. I had one boss in Singapore. His name is Donald Skinner, and he's a real guardian angel to me. So he was probably one of the best leaders I had. And then since 2007, I've really been running my own show, right? So I haven't been working for somebody, but I work in a world like, for example, international lacrosse, where you meet coaches and things like that, where you meet some really, really positive people, right? And you try to take something from each of them.
And you are positive, right? You have a very positive outlook.
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist. And you know how sometimes, like, when you get into sort of if you're feeling a bit down or depressed, people talk about this like interior dialogue where you're really hard on yourself. Yeah. I've never had that. Right. That's, of all the things, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but I've never been hard on myself. I never say, oh my God, you're so stupid or whatever. And I don't have a lot of regrets. I didn't have that much control of my life for the first 18 years. But since then, there's not much where I look back and go, wow, I could have done things dramatically different. And in fact, I'm more likely to say, oh my God, I made decisions that I had no clue how well they would have worked out, right? But I feel really almost contented. Like my kids, I'm really thrilled with what my kids are doing with their lives. The business has worked out well. We've had ups and downs, but we're having a really big up year this year. to the point where somewhere down the road I can walk away from the business and then it's a legacy. I can hand the keys to my employees and they can let them carry on, kind of stuff. So yeah, I think. But I think someone says, well, what's on my mind though? It is that pivoting from you've been working, as a corporate guy for the last 30 years, and you're not going to do that forever. So I'm in that transition to that third thing, which is not necessarily retired, but more of an elder advisor and less of a doer. And because I'm such a high energy guy, kind of stuff, it's like I'm not going to be able to sit and rest in retirement. Right. I'm never going to be a Piper and Slippers guy, right?
Yeah.
So,
are you excited about the next chapter?
I wouldn't say it's not that I'm not excited, but I'm nervous about the transition. I haven't figured out the transition yet. I'm still thinking, how do I get off the treadmill? Right. Because here's one of the things when you get into, I don't know how much your watchers of your podcast are into this, but if you've had a lot of trauma in your life, let's say in your youth, you're susceptible to certain things, and which we call addictions in a lot of cases, right? Because those addictions become your painkillers. And for the people we know, obviously, alcohol and drugs, which were my parents' issues, that's their painkillers, right? But other people become workaholics and overachievers and all that kind of stuff as a way to deal with those issues as well. I'm probably in that camp. So that, for me, coming off the corporate world for the last 30 years and transitioning to that next life, I got to process that in there, which is how much of this overachievement in these different areas was me looking for a pat on the back that I never got when I was a kid. And therefore to say, so move into that third phase of your life and keep doing the things that you find are fun and enjoyment, but stop looking for an approval that's never coming. Like just find a way to find that approval within your own heart.
Jason, we've had people on the podcast, amazing, interesting lives, just like yours. And we always ask them for a piece of advice. And that's a big thing to ask, right? But if you were to sort of summarize, something that you could tell the audience, piece of advice that would come from you. I mean, you've seen a lot, you've done a lot.
Yeah, I would say is stay principled as much as you can. There's going to be a lot of times where you can cut corners or whatever. Just stay principled. I think, it's hard when you narrow it down to one thing, right? But when my kids were elite athletes, and I would say when you're trying out, you can't control, let's say, what the coach is going to think about you, but you can control how hard you work. Just do whatever you do. If you go to that tryout, just say nobody outworked me at that tryout. So that's the part you control. So I would say those two things: stay with your principles, and wherever you are, work hard. More often than not, you will get rewarded if you're the hardest worker. Those would be the two things I guess I would say.
Well, what a wonderful conversation with my good friend Jason Donville. I tell you, you're a beautiful person, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Allan. You're a beautiful person too.
Inviting us into your journey, and I'll leave the podcast with my own piece of advice. And there's little doubt about it: the world needs more Jason Donville.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Gale Force Wins. That's Gale Force Wins. WINS.com.